Hey there, it's Seth. Today, I'd like to talk to you about that famous character that we call the inner critic. The inner critic doesn't exist. It's a fiction. But of course, the inner critic feels very real in our experience. That voice in our head, which always seems to have something negative to say, that's constantly undermining our efforts to live a better life. Now, before I go too far, I want to just let you know that I have a 12-month and a 12-week program about silencing your inner critic. And so I'd be happy to talk to you about that. There's a link below this video with information to get in touch. But once again, what does it mean that this inner critic doesn't exist and yet it seems that it does exist? Well, what we could say is very real is your imagination. There's a lot about the world that we just can't fully understand, that we can't fully know, and the mind fills in the gaps. So when this is an unconscious process, it can work against us. But we can also learn how to be conscious in the use of our imagination, be conscious in how we are relating to ourselves, such that this issue of the inner critic, it can be gradually diminished, and frankly, it can just about disappear. But one thing that's helpful to understand as well is that this idea of the inner critic is that voice in your head. Well, that's only just a part of it. So the inner critic, it's also a convenient phrase that makes us imagine that little person there. But really, it represents a whole constellation of habits. Habits of self-sabotage, things that we do anytime we seem to get just a little bit too close to challenging the narrative we've created for ourselves about who we are. This comes from our past experience, of course, and it takes us out of presence in the here and the now. So we have this way of just almost impulsively or compulsively throwing on the brakes every time that we start to move beyond the sphere of how we define ourselves. So when you think about that, you can see that the inner critic is, among other things, it is particularly an obstacle to learning, right? Learning something new always, always, always means going into the unknown, means being confused because I don't understand this thing yet. That's why I'm trying to learn it. But I have to be willing to be in that place of confusion, which generally speaking for grown-ups is something that we don't like so much. Children are a little more forgiving, but of course, this problem, the inner critic, began a long, long time ago with things we heard as children trying to learn who we are, how this body works, how to relate to others, what this life is all about. To get a more comprehensive picture of this idea of the inner critic and how it shows up in our lives, it's useful to see it in relation to 4 different aspects of ourselves. So again, this voice in the head is the most obvious, just culturally speaking, how we talk about the inner critic. But if you think about it, the category is mind. That sense of noise, that sense of distraction, right? So to silence the inner critic in terms of the mind, what we're looking for is the possibility of creating mental quiet and focus, right? The ability to pay attention to that which we wish to pay attention to right now, and high quality of attention. But the inner critic, we might say, also shows up in the body. How does that happen? Well, again, if I'm not good enough, then the way I'm moving is not good enough. The way I experience my body is not good enough. So typically, the compulsive action there is to perform, to achieve, to strive. And often people who have a lot of injuries, this is at the core of the problem. Sure, they might have made a wrong step. They may have made a particular movement that caused the body to become damaged. But the driving sort of intention behind the movement was, I must succeed right now, or got to get this over with. So it's often a sense of trying to accelerate or exaggerate what my body is actually capable of doing, just ignoring that and pushing through. I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to lift this weight even though it's too much for me to lift. I'm going to keep going even though I'm exhausted. Right? That's the inner critic showing up in the body. How does the inner critic show up in the heart? Well, of course, when we talk about the heart, it starts to feel a little more metaphorical, right? But we can think of the heart in terms of being open or closed. How open are you to your experience? And it's important to say being completely wide open at all times is probably not a smart way to live. There are those situations where we need to close and protect. But if that closure, if that protection becomes sort of the default habit, again, it's difficult to have new experiences. And of course, you can see what I'm sort of modeling here. This closure in the heart, it very quickly becomes an action of the body as well. But having an open heart is to be willing to be touched by experience, to be willing to be touched by another person, for example. And so the fourth category is kind of extending this idea, the fourth category being relationship. Now, again, when we talk about the inner critic, it's the self relationship. To the degree that I have an internal dialogue with myself and I hear a voice that's unkind to me, and I call that the inner critic, well, it's me and that voice. Of course, that voice is still me. So but we have that dialogue with ourselves. But of course, we also are in relationship to others. A classic move of the inner critic is to compare ourselves to the other person. We can do this, of course, by making ourselves less than the other person, but we can also have a sort of feeling of superiority. In either case, when we are in relation to another person, what the inner critic does is it projects. We make up a story, we make up a foregone conclusion about that other person. And what that does, it's related to this question of the heart being open or closed. We close ourselves to the essentially infinite potential of who this person in front of us really is. And because that's messy, right? That's going to require more work. Even the people who we are closest to in our lives, if we're really honest, they're a complete mystery to us. We don't live inside their skin. We don't live inside their mind and their heart. So the only way that we can really come into a deep relationship with another person is by being open. But if that feels dangerous, scary, then we do these other things. We try to control, and we don't allow that person to really affect us. We don't really let them in. And so this makes it hard to have a deep feeling of connection. And without that deep feeling of connection, we can't really feel that we belong, right? So the art of relating such that both the person I'm with and myself, we both have that experience of being seen and being heard. This is another area where we work when we become intentional in our practice of silencing the inner critic. In the work I do with my clients, all four of these areas are included. And of course, there are many specific practices that we can do together to address the question of the inner critic in the mind, the body, the heart, and in our relationships. However, in every case, the first step is quite simple. And that is to set the intention of kindness to yourself. How can we be unkind to a person? Well, one of the most fundamental ways that we do that is by ignoring them. We simply do not acknowledge their existence. In relation to ourselves, so often we simply do not acknowledge our real depth of our experience. So again, in that, let's suppose you're at the gym and you have some goal around, maybe you're working with a trainer, you have a goal, and you get to that place where you are fully exhausted. And yet, because I'm not good enough if I don't do 10 more push-ups or I don't increase the weight 5 more pounds, I start to ignore my experience. I start to ignore my body and I push ahead. Now, of course, in a situation like working out at the gym, often there is something difficult that I'm trying to do that might involve some level of discomfort. However, if I have the intention of kindness, I learn how to work with that difficulty in such a way that is reasonable. So it might just involve resting a little longer. It might be giving myself more time to reach that goal, not insisting that it happens today. All right, so there's different ways. But the intention of kindness means that from the very beginning, I am wishing myself well. Just like when you're kind to another person, what do you want for them? You want for them to have more well-being. And your relationship to them, because you have the intention of kindness, it might not always result in something better for that person, because life is complicated, because the intention itself is not the same as carrying it out, right? But if you don't begin with that intention of kindness to another person or to yourself, the likelihood of an outcome that is positive in terms of well-being is greatly reduced. Now, it's important to understand this intention of kindness is not some happy-go-lucky, airy-fairy thing. It's not kumbaya, and it's not simple. So kindness has to become a practice. And kindness is also different in different situations. Sometimes kindness involves not giving up, right, when things are difficult, because of a recognition that even though things feel so difficult right now that I want to stop, I'm going to be even worse off later for having just completely given up the task, whatever it may be. But combining that with what I mentioned before, the idea of being in the gym, that if I push myself too hard in this moment, you know, I could end up doing something that makes me less well off. But it could also be that I make a mistake, that I don't succeed, or even that I don't succeed in being kind to myself. I think that I can put 5 more pounds, and I think I'm actually listening and paying attention, and I misjudge, and I end up hurting myself. And, you know, I can't go to the gym for a couple of weeks now. How can I be kind to myself in this situation? Should I say, oh, I'm such an idiot. I wasn't kind to myself. Look at what happened. Now I'm screwed. Well, no, that's not exactly going to work either. But I need to learn that lesson, right? And so Sometimes I'm going to take an actual step backwards on this path. But the kindness in this case might be to have a longer view and to understand what exactly did I do that wasn't kind to myself. And then I decide to strengthen the intention of kindness in order not to do it again. Now, let's be clear. To say, be kind to yourself is very simple to say, but it is not easy to do. Kindness is, in fact, a practice. And so this idea of setting an intention is more than just some nice idea, right? It is continually going back to the question of what does it mean to be kind in this moment? Because kindness takes different forms. Just think about being kind to a small child or to your coworker or to a stranger on the street, or to act kindly towards maybe someone who lives on the other side of the world that you are reading about in the news. Right? So kindness takes many forms, but the practice is to continuously hold that intention of kindness. Because without that intention, again, the likelihood of creating something better for myself or for the other person becomes very small. As I mentioned before, one of the key situations where the inner critic gets in our way is in the process of learning. So above all, what we need to recognize is that being kind to ourselves facilitates learning. It means I can make a mistake and I can learn from it rather than I'm just finished, right? It means that I can make a very small improvement and celebrate that step forward and use it to spur myself onwards. And it will mean other things at other moments. But kindness, in terms of the capacity to quiet this mind that doesn't want to be quiet right now, well, it might just involve forgiveness. It might involve saying thank you to myself at the moment that I, have a little bit of calm in an otherwise distracted day, let's say. Kindness is also a kind of awareness, right? I can do something and then look back and I can ask myself, how kind was I with myself in that moment? Could be that I was kinder this time than last time, or it could be that last time I was a little kinder and not so much this time. But if I'm holding the intention of kindness, then I start to notice the difference, right? And so it's, again, it's not just a sort of a simple be kind and we're done. No, it's a recognition, and sometimes to a very fine degree, of differences in my state of kindness. I might feel kind, and then I'm driving somewhere and I get stuck in traffic and I'm running late. By the time I arrive, I don't feel as kind as I did when I got in the car. Okay, but can I recognize that? Right? So kindness as awareness. So as an example, here's something that I do regularly with my clients. And it's a way of being kind to ourselves. This process has 3 stages to it. As we said before, the most fundamental way of being unkind is to ignore. Right? So the first thing is to be willing to pay attention to ourselves, to notice what maybe feels difficult or uncomfortable, and then to set the intention of kindness, to want something better. And then the third is to take generous action. So most simply, in this moment, if you just pay attention to your experience, what do you notice? Do you feel hot? Do you feel cold? Are you hungry right now? Are you comfortable in the position that you're sitting in? What's the quality of your breathing? What are you thinking about? Okay, so you kind of just check in. And then what is one thing you could do for yourself that would make you a little more comfortable? Maybe you need to grab a snack, or maybe you need to change the position which you're sitting in. Or that recurring thought in your head, well, is it something that needs to get done that hasn't been done? Maybe you need to pause and look at your schedule and just decide when you're going to do that task. So attention, intention, and generous action. In future videos, I'm going to go more deeply into the question of the inner critic. I'm going to share some other practices that you can work with. But for now, just encourage you to hold the intention of kindness for yourself and remember those 3 steps of paying attention, setting the intention of being kind, asking what kindness means in this moment, and then acting kindly towards yourself, just to see if there's some little thing in this moment that could be slightly better for you and that you could give yourself that gift. And again, I have both a 12-month and a 12-week program all about silencing the inner critic. Happy to talk to you about that. If you'd like to learn more, just check the link below. I'll see you next time. Take care.